Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today we're discussing the recent protests that have spread across Canada opposing vaccine mandates and restrictions. The protests are known as the Freedom Convoy and are led by Canadian truckers who oppose the vaccine mandates for truckers. The protests, though, have attracted the support of tens of thousands of other Canadians who are frustrated with the continued pandemic restrictions. What are the laws that relate to protests? We have a constitutionally protected right to free expression and freedom of assembly, but what are the limits on those rights? Protests are supposed to be disruptive, but when are they too disruptive, too noisy, or blocking infrastructure that's too critical? And what does the rule of law require? Here today to discuss this are two legal experts. Mark Mancini is a lawyer and PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia who's written recently about this issue in The Line. And Ryan O'Connor is a Toronto-based lawyer who's worked on several cases related to vaccine mandates. Thank you both so much for coming on today. Now, I want to ask you both your initial take on the Ottawa protest, and I want to talk about the Ottawa protests and the border protests, the bridge protests separately. So first, Ryan, your take on Ottawa.
Well, good to be with you again, Christine. I think what we've seen with the Ottawa protest and the convoy that led there is 2 years of grievances of individuals who've been affected negatively by mandates and restrictions percolating to the top. What we're seeing are individuals who may have never protested in their entire adult lives, but feel like they have no other option than to do so because either their work is being taken away, their kids can't play sports, and they have otherwise been affected by mandates and restrictions. It really is the bubbling up of 2 years of grievances. And for it to be dismissed by some politicians as just sort of a fringe minority, to use the terminology of the Prime Minister, I think that really ignores the underlying sentiment of 2 years of mandates, restrictions, and disruptions to people's lives.
Mark, your take on the truck protests, and protesting is a protected right, a fundamental right, and it's incredibly important in democracy, especially when citizens, as Ryan pointed out, feel like their politicians aren't listening to them. But what type of limits can be placed on a protest? For example, the protest in Ottawa, I mean, they had horns blowing in the middle of the night, fireworks being lit off. What's a reasonable restriction on a protest?
Well, thanks, Christine, and thanks for having me again on the show here. This is a very complex problem because protests are supposed to be disruptive. Otherwise, what's the point of protesting? So we expect at least some disruption when a protest occurs, and we do that because we protect and we expect to protect an individual right to protest. But there are restrictions. There are time, place, and manner restrictions on the way protests can be conducted. And of course, there are remedies in the courts. We saw a class action suit filed to stop the horns blaring. That injunction was the application for an injunction to stop that was successful. And so there are limits to these things. Now, we don't know, in every case, it may be slightly different, and we'll get to this, but I think it is really immensely important that whatever the limits are, they are enforced consistently across different kinds of protests by police, and the limits are consistently held by our politicians.
By different kinds, Mark, by different kinds of protests, you mean different subjects of protest?
Yes, different causes. Yes, different causes. That's right.
Ryan, I want to ask you, sort of following up on what Mark was saying about the level of disruption in the Ottawa downtown core. What's a reasonable amount of disruption for people to tolerate? If protests are to be disruptive, I mean, when is it too disruptive?
Well, we saw Justice McLean of the Ottawa Superior Court issue an injunction specifically against honking. The honking was both air horns and truck horns, which can be very loud. And the applicants in that case argued that it could actually damage your hearing and not only just disrupt your day. But it's very clear that Justice McLean indicated that the right to protest was still permitted. The order did not prevent protesters from airing their legitimate grievances against the government. In fact, the order specifically contains language that protected the individual's right to protest, provided it was it was lawful. So, I mean, when the horns are so loud that you can't go about your daily business, and at a decibel level where it might harm your hearing, that's a situation the court got involved, but it didn't affect their right to protest generally.
When we come back from this commercial break, I want to discuss that injunction a little bit more. We will be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing both the truck protests in Ottawa and in other parts of Canada. Mark, I want to follow up with you about this injunction that was brought in Ottawa to stop the loud and nonstop honking in that city. Now, that was brought not by the government. That was brought by a private group of individuals. So can you explain the difference for our viewers? And the difference, what it might mean, the difference constitutionally, right? Like this doesn't impact constitutional rights, this private injunction.
That's right. So the injunction that was the application that was ultimately successful in Ontario was brought as a class action by private individuals, and there was a lead plaintiff. And the injunction is based around nuisance. And as Ryan mentioned, the horns blaring at a certain decibel level over a certain period of time. The difference is that the government itself didn't bring the injunction. And so there's no constitutional rights claim here. It's just the right to peaceful enjoyment in one's own home and one's own community.
Ryan, do you want to add anything there before we move on to some rule of law questions?
I think the court, whenever it's issuing an injunction, it's required to consider a balancing of the private and the public interest. And that's typically the most critical aspect of the injunction test. And the court was at least informed that there was a public interest in the right to protest, not necessarily engaging a constitutional issue from an individual vis-a-vis the government, but the court did consider that in the balancing exercise of whether or not an injunction could be granted, but ultimately did side with the applicants and ordered the end of horn honking.
Mark, you've written recently in The Line that the situation in Ottawa is revealing a rule of law problem. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yes, and this article was written at the beginning of the week, so we've had a number of developments hourly since then. But the basic problem is this. We have a police force in Ottawa that was either unprepared for what was going to come or appeared to want to continue it and to assist protesters. Now, that is not something that we would typically encourage or want police to be doing. We want police to be upholding the law equally and fairly, no matter the causes of the protest. We don't want them picking favorites. And the situation that has occurred in Ottawa now, where there's the protest has gone on much longer than I think anybody wants it to. This was mostly because the city government and the police were unprepared to enforce the law. And this reticence to enforce it and to protect the community over this period of time is, I think, very deeply concerning, because we don't want inconsistencies in the way laws are applied by police. This isn't something anyone should want.
Now, Ryan, as the protest has expanded out of Ottawa to now include blockades at our borders, do you share any of Mark's rule of law concerns?
I think anyone who is critical of these protests ought to bear in mind that there are other types of protests where they might agree with the message and not be so critical. And I think consistency from observers, and especially our political class and our politicians, is of utmost importance. 2 years ago, almost to this day, there were rail blockades throughout the entire country, impeding our economy. And some politicians argued that we ought to meet with those protesters before we enforce the heavy hand of the law. Liberal cabinet ministers were meeting with protesters who were literally occupying rail lines. I think it's important that politicians who wanted to meet with protesters then would say that they want to meet with protesters now. But also, when there is effectively a blockade of critical infrastructure, be it a rail line, a mine, a bridge, that the law ought to be applied consistently and should be seen to be applied consistently by all sides of the political spectrum.
Now, Mark, your view on these border protests, are the border protests different in nature than the downtown Ottawa protests?
Well, I think the consequences for the country and for our international standing makes it a meaningfully different thing. When the blockades at the border, they're now at many different locations at the border. When our American friends are encouraging us to get our act under control, this is not something that reveals us to be a serious country with the capacity to control its borders. And that's a separate rule of law problem, but it's just as important as I think what's going on in Ottawa. Different things, but similar and related problems.
Now, when we come back from this commercial break, I want to discuss some of that political hypocrisy that you mentioned in this segment, Mark, because I think that there's been a lot of that hypocrisy going around. So we're going to take a quick break, and then we will be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the ongoing truck protests in Ottawa and beyond. Now, Mark, in the last segment, you mentioned some concerns you had about political hypocrisy. And there are politicians who have supported these truck protests. And as you said, they opposed rail blockades. The hypocrisy seems to be going both ways, from conservative politicians and from liberal or progressive politicians. Now, maybe you can give me some examples of that, but more broadly, do you think that there's a tendency for people, and especially politicians, to tolerate or even encourage protests that they're in favor of, but want to shut down the protests for causes they oppose?
Yeah, this is a very disturbing question, Christine. And I mean, there are many examples of this on all sides. It's really not a one-side-only problem. I could think of the man who wants to be the leader of the Conservative Party, Pierre Poilievre, who waxed poetically about the rule of law in relation to the Indigenous blockades, but still hasn't, as far as I know, come out to call for the end of the blockades of the borders. Premier Moe in Saskatchewan, similar problem. On the other side, of course, Ryan mentioned the Liberal Party's approach to protests and how it's inconsistent between two similar blockades here. And to your second question, I think this trend does exist. There are politicians that are willing to encourage protests that are very similar in nature as long as the cause aligns with theirs. And for the ones that don't, they're going to stay quiet or shirk away from the responsibility. And like I said in my piece on the line, under these conditions, we don't really have a rule of law society. We have a rule of something else, perhaps rule of political preference or rule of whatever causes a politician thinks is best, but it's not equal application of the law. And it's very concerning to see this.
Now, I mean, my view is that the level of disruption by the truck protest in Ottawa, especially at the beginning, can really be differentiated from rail blockades or the border blockades that we're now seeing. A protest in Ottawa, even a noisy one that blocks traffic, is fairly standard practice. And as much as some lobbyists might claim otherwise, Spark Street is not critical infrastructure. But now, as the protest is beginning to block that critical infrastructure, highways and bridges and border crossings, I do think there's a really pretty direct comparison to those rail blockades we saw a year ago. And those went on for a really long time, too. So, Ryan, I want to ask you the same question. Do you think we're at a level where there's some political hypocrisy? Is there media hypocrisy? Is the media covering these types of protests in a really different way? What's your view on that?
I think we saw in February 2020, the coverage of the rail blockades from legacy media was oftentimes very sympathetic, referring to protesters, for example, using different terms such as land defenders, et cetera. And those are rhetorical flourishes that speak to the perspective of those reporting, whereas you saw independent media covering those protests and asking for police intervention, for injunctions to actually be enforced, et cetera. The opposite is now the case, where we're seeing the legacy media, call for, in some cases, military intervention, police intervention for the protests in Ottawa and also at the border, and then the opposite from the independent media. So there's really been no consistency in the approach that I've seen from the media, nor, to Mark's points and the point I made earlier, from the politicians. Everyone sees what they want to see in a protest. But I think we do need to make the distinction between the protest in Ottawa and the protest at the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor. We're hearing liberal politicians, progressive politicians call the protests in Ottawa blockade, referring to the same thing in terms of Windsor. Preventing access to critical infrastructure is a blockade and not to be dealt with by way of the rule of law, through court injunctions, actions, etc. But exercising your constitutional right to protest in the parliamentary precinct, the seat of our democracy, is entirely different. And we're seeing politicians, liberal and progressive, saying that that's a blockade. It's not appropriate, completely ignoring the constitutional right to do so when it's not a blockade because critical infrastructure is not being involved.
Mark, I want to just give you an opportunity to respond to that briefly.
I think again, these are two. I agree that the protest in Ottawa as of last Saturday, is a different beast than what we have now. I think what we have now is a much more concerning prospect because of the failure of the Ottawa police to sort of contain this like they did in other cities. This has spread now to the point where it's now out of control, and now we're left with very, very bad options in terms of how to stop this. We have different powers perhaps being exercised, but this is a tough situation now that has grown out of this.
We've got to go to commercial break, but we will be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the ongoing truck protests in Ottawa and beyond. Ryan, since these protests began, a number of provinces have changed some of their health restrictions. Alberta and Saskatchewan have ended vaccine passport. Manitoba has announced that they're going to be ending theirs. Quebec did a quick turnaround on their vaccination tax. Ontario has not, at the time of this recording, made any changes. Do you think that the protest is having an impact on these policies, either by sort of pressuring those governments to change their policy, or maybe pressuring Ontario not to make a change in policy for fear of being perceived to capitulate?
Well, regardless of whatever the motivations have been for those governments that have loosened restrictions, or those, like you suggest, that may want to maintain them because of the protest, I think it speaks to the fact that this is now if it wasn't before, a political pandemic, no longer a public health pandemic, because one way or the other, the decision is being made based on partisan gain in politics as opposed to science. We know a lot of the mandates are, to be candidly, completely unjustified. They don't consider, for example, natural immunity. Some mandates exist in some industries and not others, and there's an irrationality to it. If a vaccine passport is needed in Ontario, why is it not needed across the border in Manitoba? So a lot of the rules at this point, the patchwork, just don't make sense. But I think it speaks to the poverty of our discourse in terms of that this is no longer about science and all about politics, whether you want to hold on to restrictions if you're that type of government or rescind them in the face of protests.
Now, Mark, I want to ask you about some of the fringe elements that these protests have attracted. It seems like there's a lot of very normal and pleasant people who are participating in the protests, but I've seen a lot of reports of some pretty offensive symbols being used at some, and some reports of pretty unusual individuals with a bit of frightening views. Is this just something that protests in general attract, or is there something about the nature of this protest that you think attracts that in particular? Do you have any comment on that fringe aspect?
Well, I think to a certain extent, every protest, no matter what sort of protest it is always going to have laggards on, people that have alternative motives. But I think the specific problem that we have now is one, and it's one that we see in the U.S., but there is a misinformation loop that occurs online in certain channels, and it encourages a certain sort of right-wing radicalism that I think we're seeing here. It's a problem in the U.S. It's a problem here, and I think it's going to have to be something that we deal with going forward. Now, I think it's very important, though, that while we recognize this as a serious problem that we're going to need to face, we have to also separate out the legitimate concerns about mandates, about lockdowns, and the policy debates that these things invite. It's normal in a country to have debates about policy, even when it involves a pandemic. It should not be normal to normalize the use of Nazi flags and these sorts of other offensive symbols. None of that will help anybody.
Ryan, we've got about a minute. I want to give you a chance to comment on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, protests will bring individuals from all walks of life, many of whom have never protested before. And I don't think we should characterize the entirety of protesters and condemn them for the sins of some. Individuals ought to be responsible for their individual actions. And I don't think that one or two or a handful of individuals who may have been saying or doing abhorrent or offensive things in the context of these current protests really, they don't frankly speak for everyone else. And I don't think politicians ought to be dismissing the convoy and the rallies outright and the legitimate grievances these persons have about restrictions and mandates because of a few bad apples. I don't think that helps to contribute to our political discourse. I don't think it helps shape better public policy, and politicians ought to be considerate of that.
Well, I want to thank you both so much for coming on to share your different perspectives on this. And I agree with a lot of what a lot of both of you have said. I share a lot of concerns about the blocking of critical infrastructure, and I truly believe in the fundamental right to protest. Thank you both so much for coming on today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We've heard today about the ongoing trucker protests in Ottawa, which have spread to now block critical infrastructure like international crossings. We've heard about different perspectives on these protests, including the view that protesting is a fundamental freedom we have in Canada, although this freedom is subject to reasonable limits. What should the limits be on these demonstrations? You be the judge. Thanks for watching, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.